Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition and we turn now to a very difficult poem for us to read, poem 410. The first day's night had come, and for those of you who are hearing a little bit of the Beatles line, it's been a hard day's night, it's possible that maybe they're borrowing from this line. Now, this is a hard poem to read for a number of reasons. We are back to the trauma, whatever that was, of 1862. You will maybe remember already that when we did poem 280, she said it this way: I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, and as the heavens were a bell and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Or do you guys remember when we did 348? I dreaded that first robin so, but he is mastered now. I'm some accustomed to him grown. He hurts a little though. I thought if I could only live till that first shout got by, not all pianos in the woods had power to mangle me. I dared not meet the daffodils for fear their yellow gown would pierce me with a fashion so foreign to my own. I wished the grass would hurry, so when 'twas time to see, he'd be too tall, the tallest one could stretch to look at me. I could not bear the bees should come. I wished they'd stay away in those dim countries where they go. What word had they for me? They're here though, not a creature failed, no blossom stayed away in gentle deference to me. The Queen of Calvary, each one salutes me as he goes, and I, my childish plumes, lift in bereaved acknowledgement of their unthinking drums. Now, when this poem was first published in 1935, it was published without the last two stanzas for reasons that will be self-evident once we read the poem. It was published in its entirety in the New England Quarterly, number 20 of 1947. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, a playlist. I'm hoping that you worked through our set of introductory comments where we mentioned the fact that Emily's reclusive nature later in her life gave rise to all kinds of speculation about Emily and insanity or madness. I mean, we take it for granted today that we can talk about these topics after Freud and after the 20th century with some kind of elucidation. But during Emily's time, one of the really only places where she would have been able to go to even muse on the idea of madness would have been Hamlet's musings on an antique disposition. And she will, of course, have some possible referencing to the play Hamlet in this play. I'm also hopeful that you've read the preceding 409 poems. If you have, and we just finished with 409, they drop like flakes, you'll know that Emily is constantly coming back to her struggle with pain and suffering, what we call theodicy. We don't know the source of this pain, but we do know for sure that she was struggling with something. The scholar Paula Bennett has said this, quote, omitting the cause is not a deficit, but one of the poem's great strengths, for it allows us to identify with the speaker's feelings whether or not we share their cause. And I think that's absolutely true. There are many readers of Emily's stuff that say this is the most powerful and intimate poem that they will read of Emily Dickinson. One scholar has called this Dickinson's most harrowing depiction of active mental suffering. Another scholar has called this hysteria replacing language. And notice that this poem ends with a question about madness. She says it this way: the first day's night had come, and grateful that a thing so terrible had been endured, I told my soul to sing. She said, her strings were snapped, her bow to atoms blown. And so to mend her gave me work until another morn. And then a day as huge as yesterday's in pairs unrolled its horror in my face until it blocked my eyes. My brain begun to laugh. I mumbled like a fool, and though 'tis years ago, that day my brain keeps giggling still. And something's odd within. That person that I was and this one do not feel the same. Could it be madness? This? Now, I think there's actually more than one reading of this poem, and I'm going to try and share multiple readings, variant readings of this poem. One of the readings of this poem is obviously the torture, she calls it the horror of what it is that she went through, and the fact that she at times is maybe a little bit wobbly psychically. I think there's another reading, though, that reads this poem as some kind of triumphant poem, and we'll see if we can get there as well. Notice she'll begin with the first day's night. Notice we'll go from day's night to a day to that day, right? Notice day's night will take us, when we get to poem 1335, my daily night. Many scholars have pointed out we're probably playing around with Genesis 1:5. God called the light day and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. The first day's night had come, and grateful, notice her language here of grateful, grateful that a thing so terrible, it'll go from terrible to horror, had been endured. In other words, I made it through. I told my soul to sing. Now, we of course finished with our entire study of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition, 1892. And you'll remember that many times in our study, what we called Talks with Walt at learnstrong.net, we talked about how Whitman will take that distance from his soul, have these conversations. We think, of course, of Song of Myself 5 as a classic example. Notice, I told my soul to sing, she said. Her strings, back to poem 279, by the way, were snapped. It's the only time she uses that in all of her poetry. Her bow, if we're talking about a violin, for example, to atoms blown. And so, to mend her, and I think mend might be the key word here, gave me work. In other words, this was the thing I had to do until another morn. Notice capitalized, or obviously days coming in the next line. And then, a day as huge. Notice the language from atoms blown to huge. As yesterday's in pairs unrolled its horror. Unrolled is an interesting phrase, a word here. Unrolled its horror in my face. So notice we go from terrible to horror. We cannot think of that word horror now without, of course, thinking of Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Kurtz's the horror, the horror. The horror in my face until it blocked my eyes. Now, there are some folks that think that Emily struggled with some kind of epilepsy, and she's simply describing one of those epileptic moments. She'll then go from soul to brain. My brain begun to laugh. Now, this poem, again, as I said, when first published in 35, these last two stanzas weren't even included. I think they were considered a little bit too controversial. And certainly people didn't want to build the idea that Emily struggled with insanity or madness. My brain began to laugh. She uses the word laugh or laughter in 21 of her poems. I mumbled like a fool. It's an amazing line. I mumbled like a fool. And though 'tis years ago, so notice we go from the past tense, we'll into the present tense. That day, my brain keeps giggling, dash, still, period. One scholar has pointed out that these are desperate words. Giggling, by the way, gets used one and only one time. And you get the sense here that, are we supposed to equate giggling here with triumph? Or are we supposed to equate giggling here with the possibility of what she'll call in the last line, madness? The word still, I think I said to you guys a number of times that this is a powerful word in Emily's corpus. I think T.S. Eliot learned to use the word still in four quartets, for example. What does he say? We must be still and still moving into another intensity. I think the idea of still is powerful here. It's almost like a duration as at the same time a cessation. Still, and notice capitalized. Something's odd. Now, she'll use the word odd or oddity in 14 of her poems. Within, notice, she's still kind of trying to figure this out on the internal. That person, so notice we go from soul to brain to person. That I was, and this one, notice capitalized, do not feel the same. Now, when we get to poem 937, we're gonna play around with a similar game here. She'll say it this way: I felt a cleaving in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but it could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join until the thought before, but sequence raveled out of sound like balls upon a floor. She says, this one, she says, the person that I was, and this one, do not feel the same. And then she finishes with the question, could it be madness? Dash. This? Question mark. Now, it's possible that Emily is considering Hamlet Act 3. You will remember, of course, Hamlet Act 3, Scene 1, specifically with the to be or not to be soliloquy, right? Conscience makes cowards of us all, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with disregard turn awry and lose the name of action. You'll then remember that Hamlet has his exchange with Ophelia. By the way, we've given full lectures on this at learnstrong.net if you want to go back and study it. You'll remember that Hamlet does seem to start to kind of lose his mind. I've heard enough of your paintings too well enough. God hath given you one face and you make yourselves another. You jig, you amble, you lisp, and nickname God's creatures, and make wantonness your ignorance. I say there shall be no more marriages, all but one shall live, the rest shall keep as they are. It hath made me mad, he says. And then he leaves the stage, and then of course Polonius and Claudius come out. Polonius, as the father, has no regard for his daughter, sadly. And you'll remember the final line of Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet is, Polonius is standing next to Claudius, and Claudius says it, madness in great ones must not unwashed go. Hamlet is a play about taking on that antic disposition, and maybe he'll say it at the conclusion, of course, of the second act. My brain, he says, as he grabs his head. I think Ophelia is playing around, Emily is playing around with this question of madness. My Freudian slip betrays me. Of course, Emily would know Ophelia and the way in which she does go mad. It's interesting the way Emily uses the word madness, because we have a few seconds. I'll just enjoy some of the moments when she uses this word. 435 is going to allow us possibly to read this poem as something other than despair. She says, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent in your saying. Demur your straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. It is possible that if you put this poem with 410, that Emily is in fact not sad about what has transpired, but rather she recognizes the madness that is her gifted ability to create poetry. When we get to poem 1284, she'll use madness this way. Had our senses, but perhaps 'tis well they're not at home, so intimate with madness he's liable with them. Had we the eyes within our head, how well that we are blind, we could not look upon the earth so utterly unmoved. And when we get to poem 1323, she'll say it this way. I never heard that one is dead without the chance of life, afresh annihilating me, that brief, that mightiest belief. Too mighty for the daily mind, that tilling its abyss had madness, had it once or twice the yawning consciousness. Beliefs are bandaged like the tongue when terror, were it told, in any tone commensurate, would strike us instant dead. I do not know the man so bold, he dare in lonely place, that awful stranger, consciousness, deliberately face. Or when we get to poem 1333, she'll say it this way: a little madness in the spring is wholesome even for the king, but God be with the clown. Remember, it's fool, right, in this poem, who ponders this tremendous scene, this whole experiment of green as if it were his own. Finally, when we get to poem 1436, she'll say it this way: than heaven more remote, for heaven is the root, but these the flitted seed, more flown indeed than ones that never were, or those that hide and are. What madness by their side, a vision to provide of future days they cannot praise. My soul to find them come, you'll remember the word come at the opening of 410, they cannot call, they're dumb, nor prove nor woo, but that they have abode is absolute as God, and instant too. I think it's significant that this poem can be read as Emily's suggesting, I'm wondering if I'm losing my mind, versus I know that I lost my mind one time long ago, and I'm so proud that I did. In other words, I became a different person, is what she suggests. How you read this poem will depend upon whether you see Emily celebrating her departure from her old self to become the new poet that she is, and therefore the reclusive nature for Emily is in fact as we've said in earlier lectures, an attempt to try to hold sacred that promise of her gift. Of course, you could see this poem as simply, it's very hard and unsettling to begin to wobble psychically. I'll leave it to you to decide. At 2b, well, again, we said it, we start in the past tense and we end in the present tense. As one scholar has said, the tale of this poem is not complete. Its future is uncertain. We also have all the sibilant hard sounds of this poem, don't we? At the very end, right? For example, soul, sing, she, said, strings, snapped, keeps, still, somethings, person, was, this, same, madness, this. Those hard sibilant sounds, I think, do work. At 3a, the great scholar Judith Farr has made the connection between Elihu Vader's The Lost Mind, which would be painted and published in 1864-65. Go ahead and look at that image and then read this poem with that image in mind. We've mentioned, of course, Hamlet 3:1. We can also think about the fool of Shakespeare's King Lear, where he will say to Lear, I would be anything, I am a fool, but I'd rather be a fool than you. In other words, a fool that is a wise fool. And we've got that motif, of course, as Jung points out, all the way through the great literary tradition. Finally, at 3b, how do you read this poem? And what was a time that you struggled with some stress that might lead to a little bit of instability, and how is Emily helping you with that? I hope so. Thank you.